finishing up with the Israelites and their Exodus journey. We're not quite done with them yet. Melissa's going to talk to you about them again next week. But at this moment, the Israelites are experiencing the movement, their final movement from being in the time of wilderness wanderings into the promised land. And as I was thinking about this, I've been trying to think about what image I wanted you to have in your head as we started this story. And then yesterday morning, early, Jeff and I drove down to Naperville at 6 a.m. because our next door neighbor was celebrating something called a walkout ceremony. He's a firefighter. He's a captain in the Naperville Fire Department. So yes, we have two firefighters living next door to one another, which has been super fun over the years. But Mike was finishing his time. He was retiring. And after 30 years of serving as a firefighter, they don't let you just walk out the door. They mark the occasion with a ceremony, and it's called a walkout ceremony. This is the first time I've ever been to one. I've heard about them over the years, but I've never been to one. So it was kind of fun to watch. And what happens is all of the fire engines in town, like all the different stations, bring their vehicles and line them up outside of the building. So there's just a row of fire engines and fire trucks and ambulances. And inside the Bay Area, all of the firefighters form two lines on either side facing inward. And the person who's retiring stands in the back, and they have an honor guard that surrounds him. And then they march him out. They say a few words, kind words about his time in the fire service. It was fun to see Mike. Jeff and I were joking, like, will we see Mike cry today? That was our big question. We did not, but I was crying because it was beautiful. And they walked him out. And Jeff was telling me that in St. Charles, they do something very similar. The only difference is when you are inside the building, it's all of the active firefighters. So anyone who is actively working as a firefighter is allowed inside the building to line the building. Once you step outside, it's all of the retired firefighters and their family in plain clothes. So there's this visual of you are walking past all of your fellow coworkers in uniform, and then you step outside and get greeted by all the retired folks and their families. And so there's this element that marks the occasion. You're moving into a new phase of life, and your friends are all there to greet you. So I had this image in my mind when I was thinking about the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. It's designed to mark a moment of significance, and it signals very clearly a before and an after. So my first point this morning is step into the water. This comes from Joshua 3, 7 through 8. And just a reminder, we're on page 147 in your Bible if you want to follow along. Crossing the Jordan River was the entry point into the promised land. And if you remember, this has been a significant journey. This has been 40 years of the Israelites moving out of slavery in Egypt and towards this destination of the promised land. Now, scripture tells us that all of Moses' generation had died out on the way. This was a form of punishment. God had said that because of their lack of faithfulness, they would not enter the promised land, but their children would. So there's been an entire turnover in population here. The only two that are left from the previous generation are Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua is the one leading. He's now taken Moses' place, and he is leading the people into the promised land. So as we see this moment, this is meant to remind you of a bookend of the story. Remember, when the Israelites first left Egypt, one of their first stops was crossing through the Red Sea. And it was a very similar dynamic, except all of the Egyptian army was chasing them as they walked through it. But there was this moment where they very similarly stepped into the water parted, and they were able to pass through on dry ground. And here, at the end of their journey, their children are doing the same thing, which I find really fascinating. We're meant to notice that as a sort of bookend with 40 years of wandering in the middle. Also, this moment authenticates Joshua as a leader. Now, Joshua had been serving almost as an intern alongside of Moses now for many years. He had been with Moses. He'd watched Moses lead. He'd been a part of that. I'm sure they had sessions where they were making decisions together. But now Moses is gone and Joshua is left to lead the people. So the thing I want you to notice about this story, in verse 7, God says to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." So God is very intentionally choosing this moment to elevate Joshua in his leadership. And the way that he does that is to tell him, go down to the water, tell the priest to take the Ark of the Covenant into the water, and trust that I am going to stop the water so you can pass through on dry land. But at some point, they have to step into the water. God tells Israel's priests to go do this. And the Ark of the Covenant that is leading the way that the priests are carrying holds the 2 tablets that have the 10 Commandments written on them, which, if you remember, is a list of God's covenant concerns or list of his demands with the Israelites. So the Ark of the Covenant represents God's divine presence with Israel. So I want us to see that God goes before, the Ark of the Covenant goes first, but in order for this to happen, the priests have to step foot in the water. And so all of Israel is watching to see if God will do what God has said, what Joshua has said God will do. So in this moment, Joshua's leadership is on the line, right? Joshua is telling the people, God has told me this, God is going to do this. Now they're all waiting and watching to see if this will actually happen in the way that Joshua says that it will. So God goes first, but you have to step your feet in the water and you have to get your feet wet. You must take action that expresses your faith. So there are times in our own lives when God asks us to act in faith first before God meets us. God asks us to act in faith. And so as I was thinking about this, I was wondering how many of us could stand up here and tell stories like that. How many of us can point to a moment where God invited us into something that felt terrifying and then asked us to take action before God gave his answer? So I want you to be thinking about that, ruminate on that a little bit. And then my second point is that the living God is among you. This is the whole reason God tells Joshua that he is going to do this. God says, I am going to do this so that the people of Israel will know that the living God is among you. This is God's proof. This proof is supposed to give them confidence that God would give them the land that they are moving into. And Lisa read for us all those names of all those people groups that were in the land. She did a beautiful job. That's a really hard one. But I want us to see that Joshua is putting his leadership on the line and trusting that God will actually do what God has said he would do. And as I was reflecting on this, I was thinking of Psalm 23. Now, I know this feels like a strange connection, but trust me on this. In Psalm 23, David is describing walking through a valley, the valley of the shadow of death, and talking about God preparing a table before him in the presence of his enemies. And I thought about that because of the geography of this location where all this action is taking place. So the Jordan River is at the bottom of a valley, a very, very steep valley. It's below sea level. It's very deep. And on either side are mountain ranges, and they're not necessarily tall mountain ranges. It's just that the valley is so very deep that it makes the mountains feel very tall. And the valley itself, at its widest points, is about 6 miles wide. At the narrowest points, it's about 2 miles wide. So I want you to envision this. It's this place that's low, like very deep. It's flat on the bottom. There's a river that runs through it, but the sides of it are very steep and very tall. Now remember, Israel is an outside people group moving into this land. And it's not as though the people, that their neighbors, didn't know they were there. So this is a very vulnerable spot for them to be in, at the bottom of this valley. And it's in this moment of vulnerability and uncertainty that God provides for them and demonstrates for them that God is with them. I wonder if you've ever had a moment like that, where you have felt like you were surrounded by enemies, and God has met you and provided for you in that moment of fear. You see, the Israelites were preparing to cross the River Jordan only a few miles away from Jericho, which was the next city where they were headed. So I have this idea in my mind of the Israelites being in this space. They're at the bottom of this valley. Their enemies know they're coming. They know they're there. And they're in this moment where they've got to cross this body of water with all of these people. It's going to take some time. So I wanted to, at this point, moving into the book of Joshua raises all kinds of questions. And unfortunately, we're only going to be here for a couple of weeks, but I want to at least address one of the big concerns about the nature of the Israelite conquest of the land of Israel. Because who was living in the land? Remember, God had promised to Abram that his descendants would live in the promised land, the land that was currently called Canaan. And God told Abraham that his descendants would be slaves in a foreign land, that's Egypt, for 400 years. And then after that, God said he would punish the nation where they served as slaves and bring them out. And then Abraham's descendants would return to the promised land. And when it says this, in Genesis 15, 13 through 16, you can look this up, God says to Abraham, when the sins of the Amorites has reached its full measure, then God would return the people of Israel to the promised land. Now, the conquest is difficult for us to understand. And trust me, books have been written about this. If you're really interested, I can refer you to some. But they explore these different theories about what was happening as the Israelites battled the people living in the land and how to understand it theologically. And in the end, I have to tell you, I've read some of these books. There are theories that help us understand it, but none of it explain it fully. There are some things that are just difficult. But I do want to say, this conquest of the promised land should never be used to justify our own behavior. As much as I don't fully understand why God chose to operate in this way, it's not a model for us. It's not a blueprint. It had something to do with a particular time and a particular place. But in Joshua 1, God, when he was preparing Joshua to take on this role, told him 3 different times, be strong and courageous. And God said, don't be afraid, I will go with you. God will go first. And God, the living God, is among you, and you are not doing this on your own. So Joshua tells the priests, when you step your foot into the water will stop. So I wonder this morning if we have stories like that, when God has asked us to trust him and to take some action that seemed like a crazy thing that God was inviting us into. And I wonder if you have stories of times when it was so clear to you that God was with you. That even in that moment you could say, this is something that God is doing. God is here with me. Which brings me to my third point, which is crossing on dry ground. The Israelites Joshua tells them to consecrate themselves and to make themselves ceremonially ready to cross the Jordan. And the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant went on ahead of them. And the Bible tells us that the Jordan was at full flood stage. I love this detail. But when the priests of the Ark of the Covenant put their feet in the water, we're told that the water stopped flowing. And the priest moved into the middle of the river and stood there and stopped while all of Israel passed by. And one of the things I was thinking about this week is that means that every single Israelite had the opportunity to see the Ark of the Covenant. It was among them. It was in the center of the River Jordan. So the Ark of the Covenant, remember, this is the symbol of where God's presence dwells. The priests were responsible for taking care of it. As they traveled, the priests carried it in front of the people as they wandered in the wilderness. They were out in front leading the way. When they camped, it was housed in a separate room in the tabernacle. And then later, after the temple was built, it would come to reside in the Holy of Holies, where only the priests could see it. So this is one moment in Israel's history when every single Israelite had the opportunity to see the Ark of the Covenant in the middle of the Jordan River, while all of Israel passed by on either side on dry ground. God did what God said he would do. And so again, I'm wondering this morning if any of you and myself have stories like this. Do we have stories that we can point to and say, God did exactly what God said he would do? Now, this all presumes that you are in the habit of talking to God. This presumes that you have found a way to structure your life in a way that you are in regular communication with God. And this assumes that that's possible and that we can do that. So Joshua is in this position where he's talking to God and he's getting instruction from God. God is in this very responsive relationship with Joshua, which indicates that this is an opportunity for us as well. Do we communicate with God? Do we have a sense of God's leading and purpose in our lives? Okay, I'm going to give you 2 questions this morning for you to talk about around your tables. The first is, when was a time when you clearly felt God's presence with you? So hopefully some of you can tap into some of those stories. And the second is this: the wilderness was a time of formation and preparation for the Israelites. This is a time when they were learning how to be God's people, these 40 years. So how did Israel's time in the desert prepare them for entering the promised land? So go ahead and take a couple minutes, talk about those things, and then we'll gather back together. As you guys are talking about this, I hope all of you can point to moments. I hope you can all point to moments where you have experienced the presence of God, where you have very clearly known that God was with you. And I hope you have more of those moments over the course of your life. I think that's a gift that God gives us. God liberated the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, led them through the Red Sea when the Egyptians were closing in. That was one of the starting moments of their wilderness journey. And God brought the people through the wilderness to shape them into a nation, a people who knew God and who called on God's name. They had been given God's law, and they had been taught what it means to bear God's name well, to represent God to a watching world. And at this point in time, they were getting ready to enter the promised land. They were moving out in the presence of their enemies, but the living God was among them and told them to be strong and courageous, that God would go first and lead them through the Jordan River. They needed still to step into the water and to trust that God would meet them there and stop the water. They passed by the Ark of the Covenant. They saw it with their own eyes, and the living God they knew was there among them. And the entire nation of Israel crossed over on dry ground. So this morning, I want us to think about, when are those moments when God has asked us to take action in a way that expresses our faith? It could be as small as paying attention to somebody who seems lonely. It could be offering food to someone who needs it. There are a million ways that we can take action in a way that shows that we bear the name of God. Also, think about when you have had moments when it's been so clear that God was there with you. Moments when you've been afraid, moments when you have been discouraged, moments when you have been very clearly aware that you do not have within yourself what it takes to fix your situation. Those are moments where I hope you sense the presence of God. And then finally, when have you noticed or clearly seen God at work in your life? Moments where you've been able to look back and say, that is where God brought me through. When I didn't see a way, but God made a way and brought me through it. maybe for you, for the life of your family, for your church, for your community. And I want us to recognize that these are holy moments where God comes and very clearly makes his presence known in our lives and in our need. I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll continue in worship.